Joe Hill, first international guest. How you going, brother?
Dude, it's nice to be here. It's super nice.
What do you think of Australia?
Yeah, so far it's awesome. I mean, it's completely exceeding my expectations. I actually didn't know what to expect. I feel like there's like half of me that has, I've heard about the nice beaches, or I've heard about some kind of cool, cool life in Sydney. And then the other half is like, I've watched Mad Max, or like, that's like what I think
That was shot just here.
Like here in
Newcastle, yeah.
I was like, this is what I was kind of expecting. Maybe I thought we'd just like be in like desert.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't understand exactly how it mingles. That there's like this cool urban, like awesome, like a cultural hub in terms of like this side of Australia.
Mm-hmm. Just pull that a little closer.
Yeah.
Yeah, there.
So, but yeah, so I think I just didn't know what to expect, and I'm having such a nice time. It's been amazing and beautiful.
Yeah, nice. And how's the film going?
But yeah, the film is great. I mean, it's been years in the making. I would say that like that's the biggest thing I've learned from making this, is that it's just so much it's so much effort to have to make something and to try to put something together. But I think that the story itself, it's about a group of artists that are trying to overcome something that's completely insurmountable. Mm-hmm. It's a group of artists in Ukraine, and they're decide in the midst of this war that they want to create some kind of performance, and it's sort of an act of defiance against the fact that there's so much that would keep them suppressed. It's sort of, an act of trying to preserve some semblance of their culture and the things that they used to sort of like find that gave their lives meaning. Mm-hmm. And so it feels like it's kind of just worth making something that represents that like for a second, there's all of these different sort of records or pieces of journalism that have come out of different wars. And it's sort of always the case. There's all of these different stories that show, I think the mass graves and just like the immense suffering and destruction, and sort of like those things are always recorded in history. And for me, it's felt really important to dedicate a few years to create this record, some kind of historical record of the act of creation that's also part of these conflicts.
Can I give a little bit more context? I don't know what you're allowed to share, but like it's shot in Ukraine. I'm right to say this?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's shot in Ukraine?
It's shot in Ukraine.
Telling the stories of dancers, ballerinas?
Actually, it's so interesting. It's not ballet. They're a group of contemporary dancers.
Yeah.
And they, especially in the wake of this sort of, this very big schism between Ukraine and Russia, mm-hmm. they feel pretty adamant that, ballet is a Russian art form. Mm. So they're like, we are not ballerinas. It's interesting to sort of see this kind of, contemporary dance, I think is a little bit more visceral. It's something that's less confined. It's about, there's like a certain freedom that exists in the kind of movements that they're doing. Whereas like, I think ballet is about rigid structure. And those are some of the things that I feel like they've felt imposed upon by this sort of history of Russia, Russian, it's called Soviet sort of, being a part of the Soviet Union. I think they felt that kind of rigid structure around them.
What drew you to wanting to tell a story around dance specifically?
I think that it started with the idea that I wanted to show somehow what it meant to create in a time of war. And I think that when I thought about how to represent that somehow in film, dance felt like a really obvious and clear example. To me, it's so visceral. It's so compelling to watch. It's like, it is a universal language. It's like to watch someone move, to see someone express something that, there's all of these different, I think that that's what's so compelling, is that it's a universal language. No matter where you come from, no matter what language you speak, you can understand like what it means for someone to move their body in a certain way.
It's primitive. Like it's in all of us. Mm-hmm. We all, like going back in time, we all danced, we all moved. It's like one of the most primal things I just imagine us doing forever.
And I think on the other side, it's kind of funny. So I've spent the last, I've been basically doing war journalism for almost a decade. Like that's, somehow I've ended up in this world of being like a war reporter.
Yeah. And I really want to get into all that. I want to talk about that.
But the origin story is that I was like also a theater kid. So there's like this piece of me that, I can't, there's this piece of me that when I was a kid, it was the first place that I felt like I could actually, be myself, or it's the first place that I really felt, I would be in I'd be in plays, or I'd be in some kind of, there's music. I was like the kind of kid who I think would sing in the shower. And, that was something that like, it felt like there was some kind of thing that needed to be expressed. Like, I think that that's something that a lot of us relate to, that, all of us, not all of us, but I know that many of us feel this sort of urge that like, there's something in us that like should come out, or there's like this feeling that we get when we're able to let this thing out.
Yeah.
And I think that sort of changed for me. There was a period of time where it really changed, where I was a bit older, and I was, still making art, I think, but telling stories in contexts that were much more difficult. I was much more in the context of war and in the context of conflict. And I remember one specific trip I came back, I'd just been in the middle of, I went to cover a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. And it was very intense. It was a little bit beyond what we had anticipated. We were basically besieged in a city that was in this place called Nagorno-Karabakh.
And was this for Vice?
This was for Vice.
Yeah. So you worked for Vice for how many years?
I was there for almost 8 years.
Yeah.
So we were basically almost besieged in the city, and it was just complete chaos. Like, we didn't, it was really a situation where we didn't know if we'd be able to leave or stay in this place. So we thought this might be the last place we reported. And
what was the story you were meant to get there?
It was a story about, so there's been for a long, long time, there's been basically there's a region between Armenia and Azerbaijan. It's called Nagorno-Karabakh, and for many, many years, this has been disputed territory, because the UN sort of classified it as something that's a territory under Azerbaijan control. But, historically, this is an Armenian region. There's, ethnically, it's Armenian. There's a lot of alliances. And so there's a significant amount of government. The people in this region have instead voted that they wanted to just be independent under Armenian administration. So Azerbaijan took all these weapons from, they purchased from Turkey. They have all this money from oil. They had basically been stockpiling, and then they launched an offensive to try to seize this territory.
Yeah. And when did all this happen?
This was in the end of 2020.
Okay.
And it was interesting because, timeline-wise, it was kind of, I think 2020, everyone went straight to their, COVID happened. There was a quarantine. Everyone was locked away. And I think for me, to me, I think that I've always been this kind of person who, it feels like the thing that's happening, like history was unfolding. And so it felt like I wasn't able to sit sort of comfortably in my apartment. And so it was like right away, I was like out. I was trying to embed with ambulances, driving around and responding to COVID calls. And this was like the first film I made for Vice during that year. There was like the summer in the US, it was George Floyd
movement.
It was like the Black Lives Matter movement was happening. There was like this enormous, so we were out in the streets. There were like these protests, these sort of like very significant social movements. And then this war was maybe the first war that broke out in the year of COVID. And I think that what it felt like was that it was sort of eclipsed by all of these other things. It was sort of the assumption that, you could do a huge geopolitical action without some kind of attention because everyone else was just quarantining. So we went, I think maybe this is going to bring us back full circle, but I was going to say that, so I went on this story, and it was far more intense than we expected. It was like really a pretty intense situation. And I came back, and I remember that, I think that it's difficult sometimes to be subjected when you're maybe like all of us, we kind of are kids and we sing in the shower and it's nice, and we have these sort of like optimistic views of what the world is. And then I think we start to be exposed to the realities of things and the harshness of certain things. And, whether it be war, whether it be, whatever it is in your life that feels like it restricts you. And I remember that it was, I came back from this trip and I was like weeping in the shower. It was a different sense. And I think for a second I had this question, like, what is the point of doing any of these things? Like, what does it mean actually to, why do I choose to tell stories? Why am I making art? Why am I doing anything why am I a journalist at all? Like, what is the point of doing any of these things when like the world is the way that it is and nothing that I do will change it? And the reason I wanted, suddenly this war in Ukraine broke out. It was not so long after, and I was watching people covered in the same exact way, the worst possible things being documented, every single report. And then I, saw this group of artists, and I think they were like me. They were just, they were the people who sang in the shower, or they like, danced in their bathroom mirror or whatever it was. And this war happened. It completely uprooted their lives. It completely, it showed them that, ostensibly it could have proven to them that what they were doing was frivolous. Like the things that they had to express were completely frivolous. It was a waste of time. It was a waste of space. They needed to focus on the war.
Mm-hmm.
And they decided to do it anyway. And so I think that, that spoke to me deeply. And I think that, it's obviously like I'm not Ukrainian and, neither are many of the people who are going to watch the film. But I think that a lot of us are, the kids who sang in the shower. And I think a lot of us are the people who feel sometimes like we step out of the house and there's this immense pressure that makes us, feel it's impossible to be who we are, or feel that it's impossible to express the things that we have within ourselves. But there's this group of women who did it.
Wow. Bro, that's incredible.
So I think, I don't know, it feels to me, it was worth making the film. I'm happy that it felt like a worthy.
I love how you said that they did it anyways. Like, no matter what was going on, they're still expressing themselves. It's still a choice to live life that way and do that. That's great. I want to talk a lot more about the documentary, but before we move on, when you're in filming for Vice and you get sent out to like a war zone, internally, do people have to put their hand up to say, "Oh, I'm happy to do this one," or do they how do they find the crew to do that? And then when you go, like, do you have a lead? Do you have like someone like you got to go find this mechanic and you're going to tell his story, or do you just go and start just stumbling across stories? Like how does all that take place? That's
a great question. Those are great questions. I feel like maybe I have to give a broad context and it will answer some of these questions. If that's okay. So for the last 8 years, when I was with Vice News, I was specifically working for the international team. So the company was broken up in all these different categories. There was a domestic team covering, America stories. There was a politics team in DC. And I was on this international team. And so we were really, I think, a self-selecting group. We were the people who were interested in things that were happening on like a global context. Mm-hmm. And most of us had this special set of skills where we had worked in places that were extremely complicated, or we had managed very difficult logistics. We had managed, more heightened security concerns.
And has this come from doing the work?
I think that...
Well, there's no kind of training for this, but I mean...
There's one training, but it's like... There's a training called Hostile Environments Training that everyone in Vice had to take.
Really?
But it's essentially simulations of, like you're practicing first aid, so your car hits an IED and your cameraman's leg is blown off and you have to, how do you keep them alive so that you can get them to hospital?
Wow.
And more so like, how do you plan... If you're going to, if that's something that you need to be concerned about in this place, how do you plan a trip that you would be able to potentially keep someone alive in the period of time you need to get them to a hospital? Where is the hospital? So like some of it's like planning. It's like a really detailed planning. So there's a training, but I think that sometimes it feels a little far-fetched.
Yeah.
For my team, it didn't feel far-fetched. For my team, it was mostly what we were managing.
Yeah.
And I think that the rest of it comes from experience. Some of it's street smarts and some of it's just, also making mistakes. Like I think I was maybe a little bit, I shouldn't say lucky because it was maybe the opposite, but when I was a kid and I first was starting to want to be, I was interested in journalism. The first time I ever covered a conflict or any kind of conflicted situation, I was studying abroad. I was in Chile. I was learning Spanish, so like really young. I think I was my almost last semester of college, and I decided to go to this protest. And I've been seeing sort of, these images of conflict for years. I've been following James Nachtwey, who's a really amazing photographer. I'd been seeing these images, and I was like, so I think that really what our job is we have to photograph the violence, right? If there's violence today, we have to photograph that. That's our job. And so I went to this protest. Sort of like as anticipated, it erupted into violence. The police were all sort of waiting with their big water cannons, and they were shooting off tear gas. And the anarchists, covered their faces in their shirts, and they started throwing Molotov cocktails. And so it's like a pretty intense situation. And I think for me as like 18, I must have been 20 years old from Colorado.
What year was this?
This was 2016, I bet.
Yeah, I was sitting in the airport when this happened.
Oh, really?
Yeah. That was when I was going to Argentina. I was telling you about before.
Oh, really? Yep. I mean, it's the situation. Honestly, Chile is a place that protests hard.
Yeah.
They really do.
Yeah.
And so, and that's, honestly to be expected. That's why I was there. That's what I thought my job was as a war journalist.
Yeah.
And so I was photographing this scene, and these guys, these sort of anarchist guys, saw that I was photographing them, and they really didn't like that I was photographing them. And so they turned on me and they said, like, who are you? Like, what are you doing? And I barely spoke Spanish, so it's like a different situation. So I feel like I kind of took off. And I think that made them really paranoid. And so suddenly, there was this kid who ran, who took the photo, and history has this, Chile has a history of dictatorship where people would be photographed and then disappear. And I don't know any of these contexts. Like, I was an American student.
Wow.
And
did they chase after you?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I got chased. It was a group of guys that chased after me. They caught me and they beat the shit out of me. Like, completely, I got hit with a bottle. Like, it was like
Really?
It was like, they stole my camera. They stole my phone. I was on the ground getting kicked in the ribs. Like, it was like a pretty brutal sort of situation.
Is that the first time you've been in like violence like that?
The first time. And one of the first times I've ever covered conflict in any capacity.
Straight into it.
So I was like, so I'm getting beaten by this group of anarchists essentially. And this lady, ran up to me and was like, she was like yelling, "Everyone stop, please stop." She grabbed my hand, she pulled me out of the situation, and I'm completely disoriented. I'm like choking on tear gas. And she pulls me away and she gives me some lemon. It kind of soothes my throat from the tear gas. And she wipes, I have like, I'm bleeding from my nose. My glasses like cut my nose or something. So she's like wiping the blood off my face. And I'm like, who are you? And she was like, basically she sat there and she said, "Look, like, I'm with this group of moms and our kids are all here. They're activists. They actually believe in somehow changing society. They want to change Chile for the better. And these violent assholes make it dangerous for everyone. And then there are stupid people like you who get hurt and don't know what they're doing. And so us moms come and try to keep an eye."
Wow.
And I was like, this was really important for me, I think, because, before I was even out of college, like when I was first sort of trying to figure out what the role was or what my role was, I think it was just immediately clear that I was like doing it wrong. Like, it was immediately clear that it was like, oh, so my job isn't somehow to capture violence. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, I don't need to photograph the violence. What's so amazing is that like these other stories exist about the people who overcome it. Like, if I had been here and I had followed these moms, if I had photographed them, if I had seen what they did, it's like the story would have been the same. It's still about this day. It's still about this protest. And yet somehow it would have been about something more significant. And probably I wouldn't have needed x-rays in my ribs, and probably I wouldn't have, had to lose all my shit. And so it could have been so much better for me. It could have been so much better for the stories we tell. It could have been better for the audience who reads it, who like understands more profoundly, like the way to understand this moment in time. And so it was like, two things happened. It was like, one, it became very clear to me that it's about the way you make decisions. Like, it's not just necessarily the story. Maybe we all know that for example, the war in Ukraine is significant. We should, talk about it. That's pretty clear. But the way that we choose to talk about it, the way that we choose to look at it, like, that's actually what our job is. And I think that the second piece is going back to sort of my job advice. I had this huge advantage from the time I was 20 where I actually knew what it meant for something to go wrong. And so I think that it made it so that when I was managing, taking a crew of people who were relying on me, or who were trusting me to take them into and out of a situation safely, like, I was the person on the team who usually had the experience of what happens when it went wrong. So if we went to Somalia, or if we went to, we were to go to the border of Iran and Turkey, or we were to go to ISIS-controlled territory in Burkina Faso, or whatever it was that we were doing on that specific report, it was like I was the person who usually sort of felt the weight of the consequences of our actions. Like, what would happen if we made a mistake?
Wow. Bro, like, your experiences are incredible.
Yeah, I think it's hard to, like, it's funny to think about it because incredible is like, it took sometimes, I think sometimes it just takes getting a good kick in the ribs to start to understand like what you're supposed to be doing or how you're supposed to spend your time.
So with Vice, let's say like a trip's coming up and you're going into like Iran or Iraq or somewhere war-torn, your life could be on the line. Are you having conversations with them like in development, in pre-production, and they're going, oh, like it's going to be you on this trip or it's not going to be you? Or like, is there that whole process where who gets the job? Yeah. Because if this job goes on and wins an Oscar or something big, I'm sure everyone wants to get on them because they're like, this could be the big story.
Yep. And that's actually something that you're exactly right. I think that it's actually, you maybe in most of the context, it's like, I think in most contexts, people would be like, oh man, I'm enlisting in the military, but I sure hope that I get deployed to Honolulu instead of, Baghdad or something. It's like, I think that this is often the calculation. In journalism, it's really the opposite. It's like people are fighting to be the person who's placed in Baghdad, or people are fighting to be the person who's placed in, if you could, be the journalist who's in Gaza. It's like, this is kind of twisted, right? It's like, this is something that I find to be, it's like, there's something that's alarming about the sort of orbiters of truth, the people who somehow define and represent truth on this planet to be like that hardwiring, or like you're the one who's like fighting to be in that situation. But in the case of Vice, and in the case of most of the broader ecosystem of journalism, I think that it's very competitive. It's like people want to be placed in those situations. And it happens all the time where, I remember a good example is we made a film at Vice about the fall of Afghanistan. It was like, the U.S. withdrew troops, and very swiftly the Taliban moved in and filled the gap. They took, they marched all the way in. This film was called Return of the Taliban.
Okay.
And it was on a TV channel called Showtime. So this...
Have you seen the film Hollywood Gates?
I haven't seen it yet, but I know
I've seen
this
it.
movie. It looks great.
Yeah. It just reminds me of that.
It looks really great. I think that one... A lot of times I think...
I'm surprised it's like doing well in America. I thought like they would not let that get out, eh?
Yeah, I mean, honestly, America loves... We love things that, maybe there are some people in power who would wish that it wouldn't get out. But I think that like America is just always,
it's pretty wild they left all that. I wouldn't want people seeing that, because he literally just follows the Taliban into all their compounds, just showing what they left behind. Like, it's pretty wild.
So many weapons.
But sorry, back to the story.
Oh yeah, but so essentially we made this film. We made it very swiftly. It was like a 3-week process to make an hour-long documentary about the fall of Afghanistan. And so there were teams, it ended up being 5 different teams that made 5 different pieces in 5 different places, and all of the correspondents were fighting over who got to be the first one in, this new Taliban-controlled Afghanistan, and, there were all these people who wanted to be field producing, and it was kind of actually a fluke. It was really lucky for my team that we ended up being the field producers for the piece about, we were covering a section of the story where all of these Afghan refugees were fleeing by foot, usually across Iran and into Turkey and trying to get to Europe. And so we were in Turkey already. It was just a fluke that we were doing a story about Turkish bees. They're called Caucasian bees, and they made very delicious honey.
Sounds so different.
So we were in the mountains of Turkey. We were on the border with Georgia. We were just like eating, literally like waking up in these beautiful mountains, covering our bread with like honey and butter, and it was like, okay, this is great. And then we got then Afghanistan was collapsing. And so kind of our team was already like aware of it. We obviously were following, and we were aware, and we knew our proximity to, it seemed like there was a pretty significant thing that was happening on the border with Iran. And so right away we kind of, we positioned ourselves that we wanted to be sent there.
So do you wrap up the production you're on and go there, or do you just go?
Oh, immediately. We
just go, we'll get this later.
Well, we were close enough. I think that we just finished. We got what we needed, right? It's like
done.
We could have done an extra day and shot more B-roll of bees, or you know what I mean? It's like, who cares? But we needed to be on the border, so we went as fast as we could. And I think, once we were there, it's like in this case, it was like very fluid, very dynamic, under extreme deadlines, and so we didn't know exactly what the story would be before we got there. We just knew that we had to get a story. And so every day we're hustling, we're talking to the government. What are they doing? They're doing raids on smuggler safe houses. Okay, so like we want to see those raids. How do we get in those raids? Can we get into the detention centers where they're holding these refugees, and like, can we meet those refugees? If the government will let us meet the refugees, can we meet the refugees in our own way? Like, can we find them independently and build a relationship and understand this experience somehow? Is it possible? Where are these refugees hiding out? We're like, crawling in ditches at night and finding people who are hiding out and trying to understand their experience, or meeting with smugglers.
How many people are in the crew?
This film, it was, so 3 of us were Vice staff, foreigners, 1 Turkish producer who's amazing. And then we also had a Farsi and basically a translator who was actually
Farsi.
translating from Farsi to English.
Okay.
So
5.
There were 5. And then there was one extra person who I can't say by name, but he was he was very familiar with this Kurdish region, which is where the borderland.
Yeah.
And so he was the person who had been reporting and photographing some of these refugee routes. And so he was the person who was able to take us, but he didn't speak any English. So it was like sort of 3 people having to translate between either, Turkish to English, or translate from Farsi to Turkish, or from, Farsi to English, or is all this sort of translation.
So there's 6 of you, essentially. Do you have a guide outside of the group driving you around? Like, how safe is it just to be by yourselves in your own car, just rocking up to these events, just trying to get into these places to film?
On this shoot, very safe. I think, truthfully,
It's
we
fine.
were. Yeah, I mean, in my opinion, like, I think that the reality of the situation is that journalists have so many resources, especially if we have the backing of a big institution.
But like, if I'm like doing crime on the street, I'm running around with a gun, I'm doing hectic shit, and I see a group of people with cameras, to me, I'm like, they're the target. I don't know if they're with an organisation or they're doing something independent. I don't know, but like, I would assume like they've got money, they've got the camera gear. That's going to be worth something as a hostage. Like, they're the things that go through my mind. Like, why take it down on like the people that are living on the streets and that the locals, when I'm seeing these people just walk around and kind of get like a gold ticket to like, oh, they can just be amongst everything and safe.
I think that's true. I think it's true in other places too.
But not just like this scenario.
Maybe a good example is
Like Somalia.
Yeah, Somalia is that's a great example.
Yeah.
And Nigeria. I actually did a story. Maybe let me use Nigeria as the
Dude,
best
we're going to
example.
Nigeria.
What'd
I'm
you say?
doing a story in Nigeria.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna scare you. There's some intense.
Yeah, I
Nigeria
know.
can be intense.
Yeah. Whereabouts did you go?
I did a story. I've been in a couple different stories in Nigeria. The one that I think is the best example of this scenario is we actually did a story about kidnap and ransom. It was about the ethics of paying ransom. And so we went to Maiduguri, which is the city that the birthplace of Boko Haram. And in this city, we met this woman who was a hostage negotiator. Her name was Umi Keltoum. And
Is this a feature?
this is a Vice news documentary.
Yeah.
So it's available. You can just watch it online.
On YouTube? Great.
So Umi was a hostage negotiator. And essentially what was happening is that Boko Haram was hitting, they would set up these sort of illicit checkpoints on this main highway. It's outside of government control. They would, screen the road. They would take a handful of hostages they thought were wealthy individuals. They would try to ransom them. There were hostage negotiators like Umi who would basically have a relationship with Boko Haram and be able to talk with them and confirm who the hostages were, get proof of life. And then the victims, the families, would come and work with her. And she would essentially liaison, negotiate the price for the
She's
ransom.
Nigerian?
She was Nigerian. So it was kind of a crazy scenario. Like, essentially, the issue with ransom in this case was that, it's essentially financing terrorism. Like, if you pay the ransom, you're financing this armed group, and you're also incentivizing these kind of ransom situations. Like, you make the market, right? The market is being created by this.
Yeah.
And someone like Umi, who's paying ransoms, she's facilitating that market.
And if they get what they want, they're going to do it again.
Right. I mean, it works. It's paying their, it completely finances their group. The alternative is, how would you not pay this rent? If your loved one is taken, like, how are you going to be like, you're the one who's supposed to be the hardliner? Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah.
So
I always think about that. Like, they print money. And it's like, if someone wants the money and someone's life's at risk, just give them the fucking money. Like, you're just printing it anyways.
it's the same. I mean, yeah.
But I guess it's probably to stop the flow-on effect of, okay, they've got one, let's do it again, and then it just keeps going. Like, you're funding it.
Yeah, I mean, it basically just continues, right? It's like it just continues. It's like it's very well incentivized. And it's, you can do it with more power because you can buy weapons with this, what are you buying with this money?
Yeah. So you've been put in touch with this lady beforehand. So you go land straight and meet with her. You already know you're following her for the story.
Yep.
Okay.
So exactly. So we, before the story, we meet this, we get in touch with this person. We confirm that we have access. Like, would you let us follow you? Like, what would it look like? Are we able to, to what degree are we able to follow you? If you're going to go and pick up this group of hostages, like, can we come with you on that? What is that? And so we're still, everything's fluid. Some of it's tenuous. It's access. It's about this person and the relationship you have with them and like what they're willing to show you and what they're willing to allow you to film. And usually in cases of, in crime situations or in sort of ethical, moral gray areas, like a lot of times, you're pushing to be able to film something that it might not even be in the best interest of the person you're filming. It's like, it's maybe in the best interest of like the public perceptions and the people who are able to learn from this experience, but like, it might not be great for this person to show you. So you're negotiating.
And how much, like, I'm guessing she'd be so much at risk showing her face in a documentary like this. Now all the locals know she's the one.
I think
exposing all this, like, is that not like, does she not become a target?
In my impression, in her case, I think that she was well known in the community
Already.
Like people knew of her.
Okay.
People would go to her when they were in this situation because they knew of her. So she ran an NGO essentially. It was like a peace mediating kind of NGO is what she called it. So yeah, it was kind of interesting, but it's like in this case, is legal gray area too. The government pretends like they don't know that she's paying ransoms, but obviously they know. So we tried, while we were there, we knew that we could have access with her, but we didn't have any access with the government. So we're trying to negotiate. Will they talk with us about her? And they're sort of like, in this case, they're like denying. They're completely trying to sort of pretend like they have no idea what we're talking about and trying to prevent us from filming any situations with them. We filmed Umi going to a government meeting, but then they kicked us out of the meeting. And then, the next day we got arrested. So it's like, I think that it really depends on the situation. Sometimes it's the government who's trying, it's about the information is what's dangerous for them. Sometimes it's exactly what you said, where it's a kidnap situation. And it's true. When we went on this road where people are getting picked up, we were there with, a significant security presence. We went embedded with a police force that was patrolling this road.
Yeah. So you usually get like escorted around.
Well, we, instead of doing an escort, like where they were there for our sake, we wouldn't want to put people in risk just because we were there. We went along with them on their normal
You jumped in with them.
So it's like they do these patrols. We asked, instead of just driving the road ourselves, we asked if we could go along on their patrol.
Coming into the country with all the camera gear, do they stop you at the airport going, what are you bringing this in for? What are you filming?
In some countries, and I mean, in most places, we always try to have the correct permission.
Yeah.
So it's like there are countries, some countries they don't care. Like if you have a visa, then you can just come and do whatever you want. And some countries you have to have, a very detailed list of everything that you have. They'll check all the gear.
But you wouldn't be going in on like a tourist visa.
I think it really just depends on the place.
Okay.
And there's certain instances where it makes sense. There are certain times. A really great example of film I didn't make, but a great example is Isabel Young, who's one of the sort of really great correspondents at Vice. She did a film that was about the Uyghurs being sort of mistreated and put in these sort of encampments in China. And this is a super secretive story. China has prevented anyone from reporting on it. And so she went in on a tourist visa and pretended to be a vlogger. Like she was just like a travel vlogger. And this was like a pretty significant report. But the consequence is also significant in this case. Like in the case of that film, she's banned from China ever again. She has Chinese descendants and she still can't go. Vice was banned. Pretty much like all of the local infrastructure for journalism in China ended up getting closed down. Like a lot of foreign bureaus were closed because of this report. The people we used to work with in China who were like Vice affiliated, journalists that we like to work with were all sort of like put in danger. So, sometimes it's very significant, kind of the risks.
It's kind of like like in Spain, they dance with the bulls. It's like, how close can they get to the bull before they turn? Like, how close can you get to that drama? How close can you get to the war? The closer you get, the deeper the story you can tell, the more you can give it justice and tell the truth. But it's like you're risking getting hit by the bull. Like you're risking putting yourself in there. Like,
I think something that this is something that kind of keeps me up at night is the idea that essentially. Because again, it's like this is the way in which truth comes to exist. It's like this is the definition of truth, or like the most clearly defined truth that we have in the world. And like everything that you and I can sit here and talk about on this podcast that we haven't experienced ourselves. So like anything in history, anything that's a situation I've never been to so many places, and we can sit and talk about the situation. If we have that conversation, it's only because someone else has told us, someone else has presented us with what we need to be able to have that conversation. And so that person who's presenting it, like, there are so many limitations to what they can present. You can talk to people, you can ask questions, you can corroborate, you can verify, you can try to do, you do your very best at trying to sort of like define and confirm what truth is. But I think that the biggest things that I think about are that, governments choose whether or not to show you something. Like there's all the time governments say, in the case of this, Afghan refugee story that we did in Turkey, the Turkish government wanted to scare people away from trying to enter. They wanted people to think that if they were to enter Turkey, that there was going to be a significant crackdown. So they invited us. They invited all the journalists. They wanted everyone to see like a big crackdown on a smuggler safe house where they would arrest all of these different migrants, and the smugglers would get arrested, and they would use like significant military might. So it's like it's their best interest.
Really
they
planned,
wanted to show this.
That's really planned.
So I think, so I think that sometimes you become the tool. You have to remember that like people want to be the puppet masters. People want to somehow like, they define the levels of what you can or can't see. And the other thing that I think is concerning is the risk. There's one great example, a story that I think just has never been told. There, if you think about the war in Ukraine, there was a really significant story. There were a couple frontline cities. There's Bakhmut, and this was a place that was a frontline city. It was completely obliterated, and many, many journalists were going in there all the time and reporting. And what I think is interesting is that if you were to go just a little bit further east, like one city over, there was Ukrainian cities that were fully, securely under Russian occupation. Mm-hmm. So Russian soldiers had come, they had usurped the city, they had set up, they'd made it to a further front line. This front line was now where there's all the fighting. But essentially where this fighting is, there's like a 20-kilometer sort of buffer zone on either side where mortars are able to fall. So you're shooting all these different munitions, they're shooting all these mortars, and they're just falling all the time. And so on the cities that were just east of the line, like essentially completely inaccessible to someone unless you had Russian permission to be there. Mm-hmm. If you're going on the Ukrainian side, you cannot go. Those cities were full of Ukrainian citizens. They were under Russian occupation, and every mortar that fell, maybe 20 times the amount that Russia was able to launch, 20 times those mortars are just falling on them, being shot by their own country, by Ukraine. So it's like, that's a crazy story to understand that like you in this town, actually, you're under occupation. You have these new people that are controlling your city, and you're being bombed by your own people constantly. And nobody told that story because you can't do it. It's like it's beyond the limits of truth. Like there would be no conceivable way to cover that story as a journalist unless you're sort of permitted to do that via the other side.
Something just come up, Ben. Like the mission is to tell the truth. Okay? That's ethical. That's fine. We're going in to do that. Would you see people like working in Vice or wherever, I don't really care where it is, where they're crossing the ethical line in the sense of they want to go and tell the story to just try to get the film, the awards, the money, they're doing it for the wrong reasons? Because like I feel like it's one of them things where I feel like you wouldn't see that much because of what they've got to go through for it. But
I think the problem, I think nobody would say that outright. I don't think that that's a thing that people would just come out and say about themselves. I don't feel that way about any of my colleagues. Like I feel like that, really the value, like for most journalists, it's like built upon, you have to have the values that intrinsically guide you. Like you have to be motivated in terms of the values that you've built for yourself.
Yeah.
I think that I see it. I think the problem is that the incentives are clear. So for example, every Emmy award that I've ever won was because I happened to film the worst thing I've ever seen. So it's like,
But that doesn't motivate you now to keep telling them bad things at the awards?
Well, I mean, I think that if I was motivated by awards, then it would tell me, that I would know. It's like, and I think you do see it. It's like, Syria, Assad flees Syria. The country's liberated after so many years of dictatorship, so many years of suffering. And I think you see exactly, every journalist went immediately. It was just like a swarm of journalists. And the first stories that people wanted to tell were the worst possible things. It was going into the prisons, looking at, these tiny cells that they're covered in feces, and they're, these tiny people living in squalor, and these people who had suffered, and all these missing, the photos of all the missing people they weren't able to find in these prisons. So it's like that story is really significant. And also it's the one that I guarantee if you go to any publication, any American publication for sure, they have this exact story. A different person, a different case, but it's the exact same story. And I think that maybe this is sometimes the issue, is that you have sort of an incentive. If you tell the worst version of this, if you find the worst story, you're incentivized because you might win awards, you might get some kind of recognition. It's the thing that will most likely get the most clicks or the most sort of attention. So I think that sometimes, it's tricky. It's like you have the right intentions, but you also understand the incentives.
The reason I ask is when you said about the government saying, come and film this because we want to put out this narrative. Like they've got a clear motive of what they want out of it. And I know so many of the filmmakers would have a clear motive, and a lot of it is to tell the truth. But whether it's working for an organisation like Vice, that's a business essentially. They've got to stay afloat. They've got to keep the doors open. They've got to pay wages. They've got to do all that. So they have to think so much about, is this story going to be a win? Is it going to generate money? Is it going to generate awards to keep going? Like, where's that line? And I guess it's still ethical in the sense of like, if that doesn't happen, we don't get the next story.
Yep.
But
it's this total double-edged sword. It's like,
yeah,
you're exactly right. It's like, it is so important that we know these stories. It's so important that, you know, for people to, the fact is that there are people who have for so many decades been missing their loved ones in Syria. That's so important. We should tell the story. But it's not the only story. Everyone's told that story. It's the story that has the broadest incentive to tell the story in terms of the way we've built the system of journalism. So I think that there's this little bit of, I think that some of the problem is that, you know, as journalists, we sort of have committed ourselves to define, you know, we point to the problems in systems. We like look at society, we look at these different institutions and we say, these are the problems. I think that we don't ever do that in terms of our own industry. And it's because it, you know, it feels good to win awards, especially if we look at trauma so much. It feels good to win an award for it. You know what I mean? If that feels good. And I think that it's like we shouldn't take away necessarily like the nice things that exist in the industry. And yet at the same time, I think that it's perverse. It sort of does really alter the way that I fear that it alters the way that the world understands truth. Because at the end of the day, it's like if you know you're telling a story and you know that you only get to tell it once and you know that you only get to tell it through one vantage point, and you know that the best version of the story is the worst version, then doesn't that mean that our perception of truth as like a society is the worst version of itself? So you think about like nihilism. You think about like every time I open the newspaper, every time I watch TV, it's like I get bombarded with this growing sense of nihilism that like everything is the worst version of itself.
Is that nihilism? I thought nihilism was like nothing exists. There's nothing more to life.
I thought maybe. I always think of nihilism as like the abject hopelessness of nothing mattering. Of maybe.
Yeah, I see the connection there.
I guess in my sense, maybe what I mean is that it's like, how discouraging is it to only understand the world as the worst version of itself? When like maybe there's like a little bit
that's
of
so
gray
interesting. I love that you've got that perspective, and yeah, wow.
So this is something that I fear, but I do think I do think that most journalists, and maybe this is what it's really important to understand, not just like the institution that you trust, but like, you know, the values of individual journalists or the values of maybe an institution more broadly. But it's like, for me, I can tell you that whether I was working for, you know, nothing has changed. Before I was at Vice, I made films. Yeah. When I went to Vice, I kept on making films. They put their logo on it.
Yeah.
When I left Vice, I'll keep on making films. There will be different logos on it. It'll be in different platforms. It doesn't make a difference. At the end of the day, it's like the films I'm making are just they're built upon the values that I have as a journalist and as a filmmaker. I think in my case, you know, it's like, I think it's important to just articulate. It's like, in my case, the thing that matters to me, I don't necessarily think that I'm an arbiter of truth. I don't really think that I have that perspective. I don't think that I necessarily have that insight. I think that what matters to me is that in the historical record, like when we look back at the ways that we've defined history, I want sometimes these records to feel like, I want the record of history to somehow convey what it felt like to live through history. Where it's not just, you know, it's not just like the facts. It's like, you count the bombs, you count the strikes, whatever it is. But it's like, what does it feel like for the people who are subjected to this thing?
I think that's why film's so important, because we can document it the closest we can to it, experiencing it. And I think this is the big issue, I think, with like ChatGPT and all this AI stuff, is people put out blogs and just an opinion, and then if ChatGPT is scanning the internet for that information and it's going to put it back out, we're going to get this like relapse of false information where it's all the information that will be presented in 15 years could be coming from these sources that are wrong, and now it's being published as real stuff because they're using that. And it's a big, I can see there being like this like issue in the future of like where it's getting the information from, then now we're using that as the base information and building from there.
Mm-hmm. Well, I kind of get the sense that, I mean, I do get the sense, I would say as like a journalist in America specifically, I think that we as a country have really tried to define ourselves as like a space for freedom of information. Like we are the we're the free press. We're the sort of, there's no censorship. There's sort of this growing sense that, or not a growing sense, but there is sort of a non-conditional, it's in our constitution that we should be able to express anything we want to, and that keeps people in power to account. It does all these different things. Mm-hmm. But I think that we've somehow managed to swing the pendulum to the point where there's so little sort of there's so little expectation for what can be said and what can be said on the same sort of playing field, that everything is of equal value and merit as long as it's said.
What do you mean in the sense like free speech, or?
Like, I think it's like, I'm sure that not many people have seen this, but like I've covered so many events, you go to a protest, you see that there's a cop and a protester and they're in some kind of fight on the street. And you see, the wide shot, if you were to see like the bigger picture, that fight that's taking place is surrounded by 50 people with cameras. Mm-hmm. It's like this unbelievable sort of sense that like the moment of history is happening and like it's just completely surrounded by just cameras. Mm-hmm. And of all those people and, those different cameras, one of them might be, say, reporting for the New York Times. And the New York Times might be this massive institution where there's a team of people who sit in a room and they'll look at these photos and they'll, because of so much experience and because of so much, reading and consideration, they have a sense of what the role is they play and what image they should publish and the consequence of that image. And then, there might be a bunch of people that are activist photographers that just want to post the one that's going to be the most inciting. There might be someone who is, trying to incite some kind of, conflict. There's someone who's trying to blow up on Instagram. All of those people are just publishing the same image for different reasons in the same way. So it's like you'll see the same image, but how do you distinguish between these? And how do you distinguish the intention between them? When there's, 50 people who are all just like, it's the same, there's no advantage to publishing your New York Times Instagram post versus like my Instagram post is just Joe, the photographer, with my own incentives and my own sort of agenda. So I think that the problem is that somehow we've created so much noise that actually it doesn't matter whether or not we have freedom of speech.
Yeah, wow. Unless we've got an audience?
Say that again.
Unless we have an audience?
Well, it doesn't, yeah. I mean, I guess you're right. It's like the audience,
If you have a massive audience, there will surely be backlash with your motive to posting it. Like I just watched the podcast with Joe Rogan and Mel Gibson, and he was talking about when he made The Passion of Christ. No distributors wanted to sign it. And he went to a buddy of his that was a distributor, and he said, mate, I'd love to, but I won't be working in 5 years from now. So I feel like them distributors that have an audience are still being controlled somewhere along the line of like what they put out. Like that was why I started distributing, because no one wanted to sign my film. So like when I done Beat My First Fiction in Australia, no one wanted it. No one would even watch it. I'd send them links and they wouldn't even watch it. They would just write back no. And I'm like, something going on here? I'm watching the back end going, like, what's happening? And then I'd get a friend in Adelaide. I'd go, can you watch it and pause it right down to tell me what the millisecond is? And it would be spot on. So I know no one's opening it, no one's watching it. Some of them watch like a minute and just turn it off, or you'd see them open it for 30 seconds and just like turn it off. And I'm going like, what's going on? And it's like, we were talking about the film festivals before. Yeah, I don't know. I wonder how much of it is free speech and like wanting to still express that, but also not so much for the audience, but ticking a box for someone else that what they bring to the audience is still okay. I
think that makes a lot of sense. There's a great example. This is maybe this is a crazy story, but one great example is that there's Al Jazeera. This is like a pretty amazing in terms of the Middle East. Having like a free publication, like having a broadcaster that's publishing what's really happening in the Middle East was so significant.
I love it. Best news source, I reckon.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
But there's still sort of incentives. I think it's paid for by the Qatari government. It's basically running on an endowment. They can report so many things. It's so significant. They're willing to say things that I think a lot of publications are afraid to say.
Yeah.
And then sometimes there's just these little things that are so inconvenient. There was a special report about sort of exploring government policies in Egypt that I remember that it just was odd. They produced the whole report and then it didn't end up getting published, and it wasn't really clear why. And I think that there's this general sense that, like, you're right, at the end of the day, if you alienate your audience, if you alienate your investors or the stakeholders, whoever it is that is sort of responsible for you being able to do it, then you have these great sacrifices. There's actually a really good example on a small scale. I went to Somalia and I was covering a story about there was a famine. It was essentially verging on famine. There was a huge drought. There had not been rain for 3 rain cycles. Farmers, all of the livestock were dying. People were fleeing their homes. Infants and, babies were dying along the road as people were trying to get to these displacement camps where there might be UN, food support of some kind. It was an abysmal situation. And the UN has, they really wanted people to be aware of the situation. It's so dire, and they depend on people to donate. They depend on people to sort of provide support for them to do their work, to help to do this humanitarian aid. So the UN was basically bringing, they were creating this sort of like journalist program, bring journalists in from Mogadishu. We'd fly into this other region. We would have sort of like, unlimited access, be able to make our story that we wanted to. It'd serve all these different audiences. So the BBC would do theirs and Vice did theirs. That was kind of the system. And when we flew in, the first thing that happened was we met our UN hosts, and they're in, they have this compound that's like in the green zone. It's like a very safe section of Mogadishu. It's very fortified. They have like a swimming pool. It's really nice. They have, a gym. They have a French chef that's sort of like there to, all these choices of meats and like a little French pastry table. And so they're like, all right, don't judge us. This is like our one nice thing, And it was so crazy because we're like eating, French pastries. And they were like, yeah, so all it takes is like 9 cents and we can get a peanut butter pack and that will keep an infant alive for a day. Like keep them from being sort of malnourished. And so there was this moment where we were sort of like, okay, this is nuts. It's just so crazy to see the disparity between what we're talking about these people are experiencing, just like in the desert, and what people have in terms of access. It's so much disparity. And we were like, what would happen if, our report made this part of the report that we like showed this? And we really tried to weigh it. We were like, okay, so what would happen? In reality, probably the UN would, never give us access again. This would be some kind of betrayal. The UN would never show us any of their humanitarian work ever again. 2, best case scenario, what it's like people don't donate to, humanitarian causes. Like they don't trust the humanitarian aid workers and they decide not to support them. And so it's like, we're thinking about this and we're like, man, like, is that what we want? Like, is that actually like, is that the way that this should be? And so it ended up being that we just made a story about, we created this historical record about the way it felt to be sort of in this flow of this human flow of people fleeing sort of like the front lines of climate change. And I think that was the most important version of the story and the most compelling and the version that I think most represented the situation. And it could have been another story, but I don't know that it made sense. I don't think it made sense to tell that story.
It's funny how like the story, like I've always said this, like stories feel organic in the sense of, like I went to Kenya, North Kenya, and went to go do a short documentary, and we didn't even get there. Car broke down, flash floods, got locked in a compound, people getting shot at, killed, had to get gun escort out of the area. Didn't even get to the farms we were meant to film. Coming back, stopped and gave a little village grains. Like people were standing up for the first time in 5 days, skin and bones. Coming out of mud houses, no electricity, no water, probably don't even have a fucking birth certificate. Standing up for the first time, we're giving them food, and I ended up just taking photos of them. Coming back, having an exhibition, sold all the prints, sent money back, and we provided food for a while. This is how I come into my filmmaking. But I look back now and I think that story of the documentary of the farms wasn't meant to be told. I was meant to get them photos of that people in the village. And that come about in such an organic way, the way that it should come about. Like that wasn't planned.
It's interesting. There's such a balance of, I've done both. I've made so many projects in both ways. I've made films where the situation that is unfolding is so constantly changing and so unpredictable that whatever you film is history, whatever you film is of significance. And then I've done these stories where nothing, like unless you film the specific thing that you're trying to get, like the war, the U.S. war on terror in Somalia. It's like it's a war that was never declared. It doesn't make sense. It's the world's biggest government just like killing civilians in a place that we're not even at war with. Children are being affected, and it's like that situation is so nuts, and it's pretty impossible to tell that story. Like if you go to Somalia, the likelihood of you being able to somehow document anything related to this is like, basically zero. It would be like a fluke if you were able to film anything that was relevant. So, when we did that story, it was about a year of trying to just get access. Can we get to this U.S. base? Can we embed with these U.S. trained forces? Can we, meet the people who were affected by U.S. drone strikes specifically? It was like that was the task versus, say, Afghanistan crumbling. Anything you film is history. Yeah. So I think that sometimes it's, sometimes you really have to understand what it is that you're making. That as soon as you sort of lose sight, as soon as you make the thing that, I think that if you decide to make the thing that's possible, the low-hanging fruit, the thing that's offered to you, sometimes you really give over the power of what it is that you do.
I love your perspective on all these things. You're a very interesting person. I've loved this conversation. Do you want to take a second to maybe just talk about like what's the plan with the documentary? Is it going to be released this year, next year? You're doing a festival circuit? Just someone listening and they want to like look more into you.
I would love to. So we are, the film is premiering this year. It's most likely premiering this summer, and it's going to premiere in a handful of places. There's a couple different regions that we're going to have special premiere events. Hopefully it'll be in a couple festivals, but really the most important thing to me is that it's reaching the right people, the people who, I think it's for the people who still want to sing in the shower. Yeah. And I think that is the goal, that it's like this movie is for you in that sense. And we'll create the opportunities. We're guaranteed you'll be able to see it. We'll try to make sure that it's accessible to you in many different ways. Yeah. And then there's a lot more films that we're making. I launched an independent film studio for the reason that, I really believe that what we make, I think that it's just that stories need to do more than just reflect what the world is. It's not just a mirror to society. I think that actually stories are the only fundamental tool that we as people have to navigate the world, especially when it's entirely hopeless and overwhelming and sometimes, easy to just feel lost in this place. And so, what I'm hoping is that there's some people that want to come along with me, that are interested in these sort of experiences together. We make stories that feel like it was worth our time to share together. Yeah. So that's kind of the future of that's what's coming.
Yeah. It's beautiful. Thank you for being in Australia.
Dude, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
It's really, really great. Australia's great. I'm so happy to be here. I hope to be back soon.
Yeah. Thanks, mate.